Yo, what's up guys, I'm Dunmere, I'm a rank 1 peak Supervive player, and I have almost 1,000 hours put in the game already. So with that, I went ahead and put together a guide for Bishop, who is one of my favorites. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Let's talk about Bishop's strengths and weaknesses, starting with the strengths. Bishop's first core strength is her excellent crowd control utility. Not only does she have 3 of these abilities, her punch, her ranged knockback explosive, and her ultimate, but they are quite effective against both solo enemies and groups, as both the knockback explosive and her ultimate can deal CC against multiple enemies, and the punch alone can stun lock a full team. On top of this, the stun timers on her punch and ultimate are also quite hefty if done properly, and can be comboed effectively into each other. Land a good ultimate from a far distance, and you'll often have time to damage the enemy you hit before punching them into a wall for another stun, and then following it up with a likely kill. Since Bishop's punch is on a quite short cooldown also, her CC capability is quite reliable, meaning enemies must always expect to have to navigate through it when fighting her. This moves us onto the second core strength of Bishop, being quite powerful at punishing enemy mistakes due to her generalist nature. With her moderate range damage and knockback explosive, she can pressure enemies into going too aggressively into her, or too defensively back toward their team. Either way, she gets to punish them. If they go too aggressive, she can just punch them back and bully them now that they're stuck in her ideal primary fire range. Or if they grouped up too defensively, she can punch them into their team for a full multi-target stun. Yet in addition to all of this, Bishop is excellent at punishing the biggest mistake of all, which is to be knocked. Against most other enemies, many teams will be able to pull off mid-fight reses on knocked allies. But Bishop is one of the absolute best at stopping this, because her punch will fully kill wisps if they hit an obstacle or their own ally. So Bishop can reliably jump onto a target that her or her teammates have downed, and just punch them into the wall so they can't get back up. This makes Bishop one of the absolute best at countering characters like Aluna, Zeph, or Void, who have special abilities to move their ally wisps to safety. With the strengths discussed, let's talk about Bishop's weaknesses. While I discussed Bishop's generalist nature as one of her bigger strengths, it's also the core of her weaknesses. Specifically, her lack of high range threat, her lack of huge AoE crowd control, and her lack of amazing mobility remove from her a dominant and completely reliable strategy that she consistently can play into. This makes these her 3 core weaknesses. Her lack of high range threat will put her at a heavy disadvantage against a large portion of the game's characters, meaning she must make excellent use of cover to compensate for this, and try to manipulate the fights to occur in places where good cover would actually even exist. Her lack of huge AoE crowd control makes her team protection ability much less easy and reliable than a character like Celeste. This means she must have better timing and aim when using her crowd control abilities, and sometimes also that she won't even be able to fully peel her own team at all. And last, her lack of amazing mobility requires much more game understanding with how she uses her dash and ultimate. This means that she must push and kite excellently, while also never wasting her dashes. And on top of this, it means if she doesn't escape from the fight at the right time when losing, or just makes a mistake with her punch, she's likely to get hunted down. Bishop simply must play to a higher standard than some other characters, which gives her a less reliable value output overall and makes her harder to play as well. So with the strengths and weaknesses over, let's talk about how to actually play Bishop. As a generalist character, Bishop gets most of her value through her flexible set of capabilities and how they allow her to react to the enemy. This means she isn't really looking to force anything, but rather wants to pressure the enemy into mistakes and then punish them. So Bishop plays best as safer jumps and punch, while moving on to a side angle where she can poke at the enemy with her primary fire rockets. Then, she can adjust her playstyle based on how the enemy reacts and what they're playing. If the enemy chases her, she can use her dashes to kite away from them before punishing them with more rockets, or the punch if they get too close. Or, if they don't chase or lose the ability to, she can do the opposite and pressure them harder with more aggressive positioning and more rockets, and then maybe look to slam them with a jump punch if an enemy becomes vulnerable or some group up. So with that as an overview of strategy, let's get into specifics on her abilities, starting with Bishop's primary fire rockets. It's important to note that she has 2 versions. While her most common use of both is just to output damage, the empowered version does give the benefit of extra mobility if she uses it while moving backward in the air. This can be absolutely necessary to use well if low on dashes to escape an enemy. So if you're in a situation like that, it's very important to land a direct shot on an enemy and then jump while backing up to make use of the empowered rocket. But even in other situations, the self knockback is something you should still consider. Otherwise, you may push yourself out of range of your enemy accidentally. So at any time you land the direct rocket, be cautious of shooting your next shot while backing up and being in the air, unless you really want to use it. For Bishop's ranged knockback ability, there are 2 main ways you can use it. Offensively, you can use it to knock enemies into your sightlines or knock them closer to you when they're escaping. Or defensively, you can use it to knock back an enemy diver. These are what you should look for the most, as they'll give you significantly higher pressure on the enemy. The ability to push an enemy slightly forward into one of your rockets, or to knock them slightly back when they're engaging on you, can give you the slightest resource advantage to force out a flanking enemy, or to save one of your dashes for later. You can also use your ranged knockback explosion for a bit of mobility, but that's only really useful as a bonus value on top of its reliable defensive use of trying to use it to knock back a diving enemy. Alternatively, if you're looking for some extra damage on a completely unaware enemy, it's okay to just pop the ranged knockback right on top of them too as you use a rocket. Just make sure your rocket will land first, or you'll knock them away from it. In regards to Bishop's rocket punch, it makes her significantly more powerful when available, giving her huge extra strength both offensively and defensively. It makes it much harder for enemies to safely dive her, while also forcing enemies to be cautious of her jump punch range. Regardless of whether you choose to use it defensively or offensively, you'll want to position so you can punch enemies into a wall or another enemy and follow up with a well-aimed rocket to maximize value. You can also punch enemy wisps to finish them off too, which is quite powerful, especially against supports that can res easily like Seraph or Aluna. But you can even use your punch to launch enemy wisps into their allies to both kill the wisp and stun the allies. Just be careful to make sure it'll actually hit the enemy, or you'll just be making it easier for them to res. As for Bishop's jump mobility, it's best used in a pretty standard way, kiting disadvantages or pushing with a jump punch to catch out an enemy. However, it also allows her to gain height. So if she uses it to jump off of a high ground or pops 2, it can be used to go over short walls for an escape or to surprise an enemy. Also, it's important to keep in mind that each Bishop rocket that lands on an enemy will reduce the cooldown number dashes. For Bishop's ultimate, it's most consistently used as an escape tool, but also offers powerful offensive value. So either you just make sure nobody's in your way and pop it to get out of the fight, or line up an unsuspecting enemy or one who is moving predictably and slam into them before finishing them with a combo of a rocket, then punch into a wall, and then another rocket. Maybe with a ranged knockback tossed in too. Yet it also can offer some value if used at close range. It doesn't stun the enemy for very long this way, but can be used to stop a powerful enemy ultimate in a pinch, or give her some extra HP. Just make sure whenever you hit the ult to use your WASD keys in the direction you want to go to jump off in that direction. This gives you a decent amount of height too, so it can be used to jump over some obstacles also. Or combo with a jump dash for 2 on top of that, and you can use it to get over surprisingly high obstacles. With the specifics covered, let's talk about how this all applies into a full playstyle for Bishop. Though Bishop is quite powerful overall, she doesn't have as much of the raw upfront value of other characters. She can't just force herself in with a massive AoE ultimate like Shiv or Celeste, or two-shot enemies like Shrike, and she'll often be quite vulnerable after an ult or jump punch engage, while her primary fire damage and range just doesn't compare to many of the roster. So her most reliable playstyle is to play more slowly and methodically, working to secure an advantage where she'll become very powerful. Because of this, Bishop plays best by soft flanking, also called off-angling, onto the enemy team where there is cover she can use. This gives her 2 sources of value. First, it allows her to bypass her lack of top tier range, giving her a more even 1v1 against higher range characters that soft flank on the same side to contest her. And second, it pressures enemies into grouping up where they'll be vulnerable to a multi-target punch. And on top of this, it just puts her in an excellent position to punish enemies with AoE damage or multi-target punches if they just stack up and don't contest you at all. But assuming they do contest Bishop, as they often will, the key to this playstyle is saving her punch and her dashes. With her punch available, Bishop is a powerful threat that enemies must respect. They can't easily jump onto her, and also must care her jumping onto them. This lets her control a corner of cover quite well in the space around it, meaning if an enemy doesn't have excellent range sightlines on her, they're very at risk to try and contest her on such a corner. So they'll often be forced to awkwardly position in the open or risk taking a single or double jump dash punch to the face. This can give her enough of an advantage to take even 1v1s against range characters that would normally beat her. Then, assuming you hold on to your dashes during all this, you'll have them to chase advantages you secure, or just to kite back against more mobile enemies, or to leave when losing the 1v1. So this is the base playstyle Bishop should take against most teams. Play at an off angle, use your knockback explosive to try and knock your enemies into the open while you pepper them with rockets. If an enemy doesn't contest you, you'll just get free hard pressure on the rest of the team. And then when you start winning a fight, either because they didn't contest you or because you've been pressuring them well, you can swing out onto an even more aggressive flank angle and pressure them even harder with rockets until an opportunity for a jump punch shows up. Either by an enemy being low on mobility, by being stacked up with its team, or just by being unsuspecting. This playstyle modifies slightly depending on what you're playing against though. Against enemies that can pressure you through walls, you might want to accelerate the fight and look for a jump punch a bit earlier. Against enemies with incredibly high mobility, you'll need to play for more distance and consider saving your knockback explosive for extra counter dive utility. Yet both of these modifications play out toward the same goal. You want to pressure the enemy with damage and CC into making the mistake of taking a worse position or to stack on top of their team. Now on the opposite side of this, if you begin losing in these situations, you want to kite back slightly out of their range and heal up or punish them if they get too aggressive and become vulnerable. In this, your biggest goal in being pressured is just to get back into a neutral or strong 1v1 position, so you basically just want to stay alive. With this strategy, it's always useful to save her ultimate also, as it gives her a constantly reliable capability to escape if you overcommit and don't get enough value, and also enables her to bypass the risk of getting third-partied. Also, while using this general playstyle, as fights go on, you'll want to be watching for opportunities to punch finish the wisp of an enemy that gets knocked, especially when playing against Aluna, Zeph, or Void. Oftentimes, your team will be low on resources after securing the kill, so they can't quite afford to risk their life to stomp an enemy that died toward their team. So if you won't have to commit too much, look to jump punch the wisp, and especially look to punch either the wisp and Aluna ults, or maybe even her if she gets too close. This is the most standard gameplay style that will be the most valuable strategy in most situations, but sometimes you'll find yourself in need of speeding your gameplay up dramatically, such as in situations like being pushed by the storm, or if your team is full of close range divers and theirs is long range pokers. In these situations, you should look for an ult engage, which is also often best done from a slight side angle, as it'll make it harder for enemies to predict you. Your job in this situation is to provide a safe engage for your allies. So after the ult goes off, you should look for a punch, ideally one that hits multiple enemies. If you land this, you and your team will likely just be able to frag out. But if you don't land a punch or the fight is still neutral, you should look to position yourself on a side angle to avoid the AoE damage that will inevitably be tossed right where you engaged. From there, you should assess the situation. If you're winning, you should push them and finish the fight quickly. If neutral, play like a somewhat sped up version of the base playstyle. And if losing, kite away and look for an escape. Even in this, your biggest priority is still going back to the basics. Only use your dashes when necessary, and your punch when opportunities arise. And overall, just making sure to stay alive. Also, when playing with a dive-based composition, your teammates will often need to slow down after hard engaging, to get some time to heal up and regain their dashes. Pay attention to this, and don't take too much damage when they can't participate in the fight. Otherwise, you'll just tank too much aggro from the enemy when your team can't support you.